Well, hello everybody. It's been a bit of time since I've made a video, 2 weeks in fact. I was sick making a very long video that I'm actually going to condense, and that's what this video actually is, a condensed version of the video I was working on. And then when I recovered, it became time for the holidays, and unfortunately I just was sick. And yeah, as soon as I got better, I just didn't have time with all the everything going on with the celebrating Christmas and everything. Focusing on that, my family, and on the meaning of Christmas as well. So it's been busy, but I'm very excited to get back to making videos, and that's gonna start with this video now, and the next week or another episode of the podcast. So very excited about both of those. So I figured if I'm gonna come back, why not come back with a very controversial video? And so that's what I'm doing today. Of course, I'm joking around about that. I don't really want to make a video like this, but in terms of the controversy that may arise from it, but it's also something that needs to be made, in my opinion. So in this video, what we're going to be doing is going over a certain verse in the Bible that certain people, I'm not sure if it's a very popular opinion or how many people actually believe this, but that some argue bans drinking alcohol in moderation. They're not arguing that it bans drunkenness, they're arguing that it bans drinking as a whole. Now, I do not believe that drinking in moderation is a sin, hence why I'm arguing against this and tackling their arguments that they make. So I don't know, again, how many people actually hold to this position, but I did recently see a video come out by Gospel Broadcasting Network that was entitled Drinking is a Sin, where they argued the argument that we're about to go over and that I'm going to explain today. And then there's another person, Wayne Jackson, you may have heard of him. They have a very popular commentary in the Churches of Christ space, who argues a similar argument based on the word and verse we're going to be going over, but not the same exact argument. In my opinion, his argument is more sound logically, but it fails in its conclusion. Whereas the other argument, that Gospel Broadcasting Network made, is if it was true, if its conclusion could be reached, would be the much stronger argument. Although, as we're going to go over, their argument fails very badly. And originally, the video I made was targeting their video, and it was about a 3-hour video, and it was uploaded to YouTube. Everything was ready to post, but I decided to take it down, and for reasons we'll go over later. I'm not ashamed of anything in the video and anything like that, or I don't disagree with anything I said, but I figured a 3-hour video probably wasn't the way to handle the argument. And I figured I might as well just do a condensed version here because it would fulfill its purpose. And so what we're going to be going over today is 3 main points about why their arguments don't work, and there are going to be some sub points kind of sprinkled in here and there, and we are going to be tackling some things that they brought up. However, I'm not making this video to be a direct response. I'm just going to respond to the argument as a whole for essentially anybody that makes the argument, rather than just one specific video. So to get started, let's just go ahead and get right into reading the verse. We're going to look at 3 different translations of it so that people know I'm not just trying to pick one translation that proves my point. We're going to look at 3 different translations, and then we're going to get into some other scholarly stuff. But let's start now with just 3 different versions of this verse. All right, so the verse in question is this verse here. It's 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3. Now, the word that is in parentheses here is the word that we're going to be talking about today, the word that's in question and that this entire argument or arguments is formed around. So, reading 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3, we read from the ESV version, For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, that's potos, that's the word right there that is in question, and lawless idolatry. So now let's go ahead and get into the next version, which is the KJV, and this reads, For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lavishness, lusts, excesses of wine, revelings, banquetings, again, potos, and abominable idolatries. And then the final version we're looking at today is the NASB and the 95 version to be specific. And this reads, For the time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, again, potos, and abominable idolatries. Now, as you can see here, let me see if my mouse is free. Okay, it is. My mouse is showing up. These are underlined: the desire of the Gentiles, the will of Gentiles, what the Gentiles want to do, because this is going to be very important for the context of this verse and why the arguments that they are making don't follow exactly. So again, let's look at the translations. Potos is translated as drinking parties, as banquetings, and again as drinking parties. So with that, let's go ahead and get into some more stuff. So the reason why it was important to look at these translations and how this word is translated as is because the main argument that Gospel Broadcasting Network and some others make is that this word potos doesn't actually mean what the translations are essentially saying it means, but rather that it means drinking, plain, just drinking alcohol, general drinking, any form of drinking, just that, plainly, the action of drinking. Now, this carries with it a lot of issues, as we're going to get to in a second. But first off, one of the first points I want to make is that this word does not actually mean general drinking. Their argument fails right off the bat because they want it to. Now, one of the main things, and from what I can tell, the reason why they will argue this is because the literal translation, some will argue, but not all, some will argue the literal translation of potos from Greek to English is drinking. Now, that actually isn't a 100% agreed upon thing. There are some that argue that it's better literally translated as drinking parties and not just the general word drinking. Now, their main argument from this then seems to be that because the literal translation of it from Greek is drinking, that therefore it means drinking. But that's a very important point to make, because that actually does not follow. We have to be very careful when we're talking about literal translations, because literal translations don't always equal literal meaning. For example, the word hippopotamus being translated from Greek to English, its literal translation is river horse. Hippopotamus. Those are two different words. Translated to English are river horse. Of course, the meaning of hippopotamus or hippo in English isn't river horse. We actually we know that a hippo is not just a river horse. And if I tell you, look out for the hippopotamus at the river, you wouldn't go down there expecting to see a horse inside of a river. If you did, then you'd be very mistaken, and you would be making the mistake of taking the literal translation as being the meaning. Now, there's a reason why we see both in these translations in the scriptures in English not translating it as general drinking, and why, as we're about to get into, the scholars don't translate it as general drinking. And that's very, very precisely because it doesn't mean general drinking. It means a sort of event. And throughout this video, I want to make this known. I'm going to refer to potos as an event. And what I mean by this is that it is not the general action. It is an event, essentially. It is a noun. And as we're going to get and show that, we're going to show that in a second. But essentially, when I say event, I just mean that it is something like that, and it's not the general action. Just like eating is not the same thing as a restaurant party or something like that. They're two different things. One's an event and one's an action. And so when I say an event, I'm just meaning that's the general meaning of potos. In my opinion, it's best translated as something like banquetings, or a drinking party is fine, but I think it's more accurately translated in this context, especially as a banquet. And we'll get into that, into why that is in a second. But that's the first point I want to make, is that this word does not mean what people from, for example, people like from Gospel Broadcasting Network want it to mean in terms of general drinking. We just don't find that anywhere in the scholarship. We don't find that in the translations. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it because that is the main crux of their video. That's how they conclude the video, is arguing the final line. They argue that potos means drinking generally. And throughout the video, they offer zero argument for that, other than the fact that an outdated lexicon, the BAG, the original BDAG, which is the gold standard lexicon, translated as drinking, especially a drinking party, which the issue with that is that when a lexicon specifies especially, it's meaning that that is the most likely case of what it actually is. The fact that drinking was the first translation is most likely because that it's its first lineup in the definition is most likely because, number one, it's an outdated lexicon. Number two, because drinking is the literal translation of potos, even though it's not the meaning. And number three, we see that it is specifically added on that it is both a drinking party or a carousal. So, and it says especially so. So when something is especially so, that is its core meaning. And so that argument doesn't work either. Yet that's the entire point of the video, is they're trying to argue that potos does mean drinking in a general sense. So regardless of that, I'm talking too long. I want to go ahead and get into the next stuff, the next scholarly stuff, to argue that the scholars also agree that it doesn't mean general drinking. All right, so the first points of scholarship that we're going to look at is BDAG. So this right here is the BDAG definition of potos. Now, BDAG, if you're not aware, is the gold standard lexicon for Greek, in especially New Testament Greek. And so that's why it is the first one we're going to look at, because it is the gold standard, and I don't think anybody disagrees with that. So BDAG specifies that potos means a social gathering at which wine was served, a drinking party. Now, if you see down here, it also adds something for 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3 specifically. And it says in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3, it is here probably in the sense of carousal. In the Greco-Roman world, it was customary for literati to hold banquets, again banquets, at which topical discussions were featured with participants well lubricated with wine. Now, this is super interesting, because what we're finding here again is that it's not general drinking. It's most broadly a social gathering at which wine was served. So it is some sort of event where there is wine, and that is specified when you look at like a drinking party or a carousal. So the first and one of the most important things we need to point out is that this is a neutral term, and we're going to get into why that's important to point out in a little bit. Next, you see that there are some other definitions. So the outline of its biblical usage. This stuff is from Bible Hub. Bible Hub is a fantastic source where you can find all sorts of different lexicons and commentaries. So this is where this is from, and I will put it in the description below. The first we see is that it's a drinking or a carousing. Now, many will be tempted when they see a drinking to think, well, hey, wait, doesn't that mean that it is the term for general drinking? Now, in the longer video, I provided a thorough argument for why this isn't the case, and here I'm going to make it very short. The reason why when we see that a drinking is not the literal meaning of the verse is put simply because, number one, again, the literal translation issue, and secondly, because a drinking is different than drinking. In older English, you would have people say that they were going to a drinking as if they're going to a party or a meeting. This is, and same thing in older English, you'd see people say they have an ale. But the problem with that is that nowadays, if we heard an ale, we'd be confused because we automatically think of ale as a drink. But an ale was an event in the older English. So a lot of translations will say, or a lot of older lexicons will say a drinking. But seeing this as a noun and the surrounding context, it only makes sense that in that context, it's actually specifying that a drinking is an event. Now, on Strong's, we see that it translates or it defines rather potos as a drinking bout or carousal or banqueting. And Thayer's also specifies a drinking, carousing. So again, this is going to be very important because we're seeing over and over again that it's making sure to specify that this is an event and it's not the general act of drinking. So on the lexical summary, again, this is where the argument comes from. As you see, drinking, banquet, feast. However, remember, these all paired together cannot be separated. It is obvious here that it's making sure that you realize that it is a event and that drinking most likely is the most literal translation of it. So it doesn't follow that because the most literal translation is drinking, arguably, although again some disagree with that it means drinking. And we can also see that the origin of it is plainly drink. That is why the most literal translation, some will argue, is drinking, but that doesn't mean that's the meaning. Again, the definition itself down here is a drinking bout or carousal. And again, we see banquet and feast up there as well. Now, we're going to get into some more scholarly stuff here, and we see in the topical lexicon we can read singular appearance in the New Testament. This term occurs only once in 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 3, where Peter lists behaviors and characteristics of the Gentile lifestyle from which believers have been redeemed. You have spent enough time in the past carrying out the will of the Gentiles, that's very important, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. Its placement between drunkenness and orgies highlights a form of communal excess distinguished from private inebriation, emphasizing a social setting devoted to unrestrained consumption. Then we have cultural and ancient context. Greco-Roman society prized convivial banquets, symposia, and festival gatherings honoring deities such as Dionysus and Bacchus, or rather Dionysus, who's also called Bacchus. These events blended drinking, revelry, and often sexual immorality, functioning as both civic entertainment and religious observance. First century converts, especially in Asia Minor, where 1 Peter is addressed, would have felt social pressure to participate. Refusal could incur ostracism or economic loss. And then you see in the next verse, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 4, it reads, "They are surprised that you do not plunge with them into the same flood of reckless indiscretion, and they slander you." Now, this next part, this is all very, very important for our argument. But this next part is incredibly important. The historical reception in the church. Early Christian apologists such as Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria cited Peter's words, so here, and especially regarding the word potos, this is very important here, when challenging pagan banquets. Okay? You guys, remember, the Gentiles were what? Pagans. That is what they were. So in this verse, in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3, when they are addressing the pagan banquets, that's what Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria cited this for, when they are citing it for that reason, that is because they understood that potos was an event. And on top of that, because they knew the culture themselves, they understood that what Peter was targeting was specifically the pagan lifestyle, the Gentile lifestyle. Gentile, pagan are the same, because if you were a Gentile, you were a pagan. That was the state religion of the Greco-Roman world in Rome. So what we're seeing here is that the potos in 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 3 is, by definition, it is pagan. That the verse even specifies that. Again, that's why I underlined it in the original translations we looked at, because I was highlighting this. And we'll read again here, "For you have spent enough time in the past carrying out the will of the Gentiles," right? So anything he's going to be targeting after specifying that is the will of the Gentiles is going to be about the Gentiles themselves. That is why he specifies lust, drunkenness, living in debauchery, idolatry, orgies, and then what's right here? Carousing. That is potos. The potos he's targeting is specifically the Gentile potos. Now, this is actually from the video, the Gospel Broadcasting Network video. Now, in here, they quoted Trench. Now, here's the problem with what they did. They started off as potos, and then acted as if this right here is going to be the quote. When you look in Trench, this is what you'll find. Is potos does not necessarily imply excessiveness, though it does provide an opportunity for excess. Here's the problem. The full quote actually looks much different, and they kind of cut this. As I said, they did not include the first half, and it was taken out of context. The full Trench quote says that it's the drinking bout, the banquet, the symposium. Then it says, at this point, this isn't where the quote starts. It's in the middle here. Not of necessity excessive, but giving opportunity for excess. Now, why does this matter? We didn't go over this now, but in the video, they showed this quote immediately following and arguing that drinking was potos was a term for general drinking. So they quoted this verse in support of their position. The problem is the full quote and the full context argues that it does not mean general drinking, that it does mean something like the banquet or the drinking bout or the symposium. And then about those events, they are not of necessity excessive, but they do give opportunity for excess. Now, the other reason that we showed this quote, or reason I'm showing this quote, is because it actually is really important for the other argument that that people sometimes make against drinking using potos, and that is that potos actually means an event, but that it is an event that does not necessitate that you get drunk. And because it does not necessitate that you get drunk, it bans drinking generally as a whole. Now, there's a lot of issues with this. First off, again, that wouldn't actually follow because the word potos is about a specific type of event, and in the context of 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 3, a pagan event. And so because of that, just because the drinking at these events did not actually necessitate that people got drunk, does not follow that the reason why it's being banned is because of the drinking that is occurring. If he wanted to ban that, he would have banned drinking generally, but he didn't. However, another important note to make is that even if this was the case, even that if this was the case that it had nothing to do with paganism and it was an event that denoted drinking but not excessively, it actually wouldn't prove the point, because we can point to other examples of things that are in excess are dangerous, but limited they aren't. So for example, being a glutton is a sin, right? Except the fact that eating in moderation obviously is not a sin, right? Just because eating does not necessitate being being glutton or eating to excess, that does not mean suddenly that eating generally or moderately is sinful. Same thing with this word. Now, another quote that they used in the video immediately following this trench quote, they quoted A.T. Robertson. And they quoted A.T. Robertson as saying, "In the light of these words, it seems strange to find modern Christians justifying their personal liberty to drink and carouse." Now, he said this on 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3. Again, the problem here is he took it out of context. A.T. Robertson explicitly defines it as drinking parties or carousings. This is what he defines potos as. Now, then he specifies that it's an old word for drinking carousal, and it's from pino, which means to drink. That is the root of potos. And here, this is the only word in the New Testament. So that is his scholarly take on it. The rest of this is his personal opinion. And he says, in the light of these words, it seems strange to find modern Christians justifying their personal liberty to drink and carouse, to say nothing of the prohibition law. But notice there, they cut this out. In the original quote they quoted, they cut out the fact that there's a comma here. And this is really important, because after this comma, when he says to say nothing of the prohibition law, A.T. Robertson was living during the American Prohibition, and he was a Baptist. Why does this matter? Because the context he was writing in was one where drinking as a whole, no matter what, was banned in America. It was against the law to drink. It was during Prohibition. And so that would obviously have influenced his opinion. But yet again, this is nothing but an appeal to emotion. It's a fallacious argument to point to his words to then try and apply them in some sort of scholarly sense. Because again, everything after the NT, the New Testament, in his quote is his personal opinion. Before that is his scholarly take. And we see here it does not mean general drinking. And remember, they quoted this, they put this quote up immediately after asserting that potos did mean general drinking, or that the main focus of the word is general drinking. So it is quite honestly a pretty disgusting thing to do. And one of the reasons why I decided not to put the main video up is because I got quite angry during it. It was justified, especially for some other stuff that I'm not even going to go into that they did that was just kind of, in my opinion, pure slimy tactics. However, and again, I'm not going to go into all of that. But I want to make it known, again, the scholarship across the board is showing here that potos is meaning an event, specifically something like a banquet. As we see, the earliest Christians quoted these words, specifically the words of Peter in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3, as targeting pagan banquets. So obviously it would make sense that that's the reason why Peter is banning it, is because they are pagan banquets, and not because there is drinking that is occurring there. So we've shown now that potos is not translated in terms of its meaning into the Bible and translations as drinking in a general term, because that's not what it means. We're seeing the scholarship shows that it's not a general term, and we've shown that the argument that just because it does not lead to excess and it contains drinking in the event does not follow then that it bans drinking as a whole here. Again, we're seeing that in the context, the pagan context, it makes sense why Peter would be banning these. Because again, he says the will of the Gentiles, the pagans. And then the earliest Christians interpreted this verse as targeting these pagan banquets and not as drinking generally. Now, we're going to do some more videos in the future. I'm going to do some more videos showing further why drinking is not a sin, and why even the earliest Christians drank wine weekly, because that is what the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper was partook with. The fruit of the vine was wine. And I'm going to show, again, I'm going to do videos in the future on that. I'm not going to shove all that into this video, but we are going to do videos on that. We're going to see both the historical context and the biblical context about why drinking is not a sin. But that's for another time. Going back to this video, in the Gospel Broadcasting Network video, I do need to point this out because they may try and argue, people may try and see their video and be like, hey, you left this out and this was a big point of it. In that video, they went back to older places like the Septuagint or some other Greek scholars of the time to show that potos did not necessitate drunkenness. Now, they did this because a very big part of their video was actually trying to attack a straw man of how people defend this verse, people like me. They were, in their video, arguing that people argue that potos means drunkenness, but we don't argue that at all. What we argue is that it's an event, and specifically in this context, a pagan event that Peter was banning, and he wasn't banning drinking generally. However, in their video, Gospel Broadcasting Network was arguing over and over, I would argue probably for about 20 minutes of the video, honestly, that potos does not mean drunkenness, even though nobody argues that it does mean drunkenness. And so in doing so, they actually did a lot of damage to their own argument. At one point in their video, when overviewing the Septuagint's usage of potos, and in case you don't know, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was around in Jesus' time. They were showing that the usages there don't actually demand that people are drunk when that word potos is used. Now, again, they did this to argue against the fact that people, according to them, say that potos means drunkenness, even though, again, I'm not arguing that. Nobody, as far as I can tell, does. However, in doing so, they came across some very bad things for their own argument. For example, the biggest issue that they made is that at one point, they said, does this sound like this event, or does it sound like in the usage of potos in this Old Testament verse that this is a wild, drunken party? Now, why does that matter? Obviously, again, they were quoting that to try and show that potos does not mean drunkenness. But in saying that, they disproved their own definition of potos. Why? They're quoting the Septuagint as authoritative in this sense, or in their context, to try and show that it doesn't mean drunkenness, which, they successfully did, because, again, we don't argue that. However, in saying that, they disproved their own definition of potos. If in their view, potos means general drinking, and so when you see the word potos, it means that they are drinking generally, then their quote wouldn't stand. Again, I think I may have misspoke, so let me say again. They said, does this sound like the word potos is being used here to show a wild, drunken party? There's no indication, in fact, that it's being used for this sense at all. The problem with that very argument, that there is no indication that there's any alcohol being drunk at all, disproves their definition of potos meaning general drinking. Because if the word potos was being used in Septuagint, in their view, that would mean that it is being used for drinking. When that word shows up, it means drinking. And so because, in his view, there was no indication of any drinking happening in the verse where potos was used, that would disprove his own definition. Except he kind of separated his video into two different parts. One arguing that potos does not mean drunkenness, and another arguing that it means general drinking. And it seems like maybe they recorded at the same time, but it seems like when he was writing the script, maybe he didn't see the connection between the two, and why saying that in regards to the Septuagint disproves his entire argument. Now, another thing here is that he also will argue, for example, with Lot, that it does not necessitate drunkenness. Here's the problem, though. In his view, if drinking is inherently sinful, and then also potos means general drinking, then it would seem that he would have to condemn Lot as providing a sinful meal or sinful action to the angels. Except we see throughout the Bible, and also scholars agree on this, that Lot's action of providing a potos, a banquet, a feast to the angels was a good action of hospitality. And yet, in his view, if potos means general drinking, then he would have to condemn not only Lot, but people across the Old Testament that potos was applied to. When we see several instances, for example, in Esther as well, where potos is used, that doesn't actually denote sinfulness, and is actually used in a positive light. And so he has to explain why that is again, but he's already disproven his own point again when he argues that there's no indication of any alcohol being drunk when potos is used, when in his view, potos literally means general drinking of alcohol. But I don't want to go too far into that, where this video is probably already getting long as is. But I do want to get into another argument he makes. So he argues that because Peter in this verse, in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3, had already used a word for drunkenness. And in fact, let's go ahead and pull it up again. So here we see that Peter had already used a word for drunkenness. And I believe the word here is oinodothea. That because of that, potos can't mean drunkenness. Again, he spent a lot of his time in his video arguing this, and I don't hold to that, so it doesn't affect my position at all. However, essentially, the argument he was making here is because Peter had already used a word for drunkenness, therefore, potos couldn't mean drunkenness, because if it was, then Peter would be being repetitive. He wouldn't be, but that's not what Peter is doing. He's not just like repeating himself. He's not saying drunkenness, orgies, and drunkenness. Obviously, that would make no sense. However, here's the problem with that argument. It is a perfectly sound argument. It's not a defeater, obviously, but it is a good point to bring up if people argue that potos means drunkenness, and I would bring that up as well. However, here's the issue. We can use that argument to actually disprove his own position. And why is that? Because in his view, if potos means general drinking, then in this verse, Peter would be being repetitive. Because think about it. If Peter wanted to ban drunkenness and drinking as a whole, he wanted to state flat out that drinking is a sin, I want it banned, then why would he include drunkenness instead of just including potos? Think about it. If potos means general drinking, and that's what Peter intended for it to mean, then there would be no reason for him to include drunkenness, because drunkenness would be covered by general drinking, right? It'd be like going to a doctor and the doctor is saying, I ban you, you are no longer allowed to eat fruit because, for some reason fruit is really bad for you, so you cannot eat fruit, and also don't eat apples. Well, it would make no sense for the doctor to tell you to not eat apples, because eating apples would be covered under the entire ban of eating fruit. In the same way, there'd be no reason for Peter to include drunkenness or banning drunkenness, because that would be included under all drinking, even moderate drinking, right? Peter would just have to say, the time has passed for you to do things like living in sensuality, passions, orgies, and drinking, and lawless idolatry. There'd be no reason for him to include drunkenness, because drunkenness would be included under potos. But obviously, the reason why he does include potos is because potos doesn't mean general drinking. It is specifically referring in this verse, again, we can see this in the other translations, to things like banquetings. And in this verse, Gentile or pagan banquetings. And that's exactly how the earliest Christians, again, Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria, interpreted this verse and this word. It doesn't mean general drinking. It means a drinking event or a banquet. Again, I'm going to argue it means that because it's specifically the context of the time And the earliest Christians are arguing it means a pagan banquet in this context. So I hope that all of that makes sense. I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping up the video now. I know this is a little bit more scattered, but that's because I'm really trying to compress 3 hours of content from another video that I made into this short, maybe, 30-minute long video. And the reason why, I mentioned in the beginning, the reason why I would explain why I decided not to post the video. The reason why is honestly because 3 hours, nobody's going to sit down and watch that. Nobody's, I don't think, interested in this topic enough. That video was a lot of me repeating myself because he kept asserting things over and over that were essentially baseless. And I felt like in order to fully respond to the video, I had to repeat myself just as he was repeating himself. And a lot of the video was just long, and I am very proud of it because the research I put into that video was incredible. I have an incredibly long list of sources and an entirely long outline and script that I wrote. But in the end, I just felt like something like this would be better. Now, again, I want to quickly summarize. What Peter is banning in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3, when he mentions potos, is not general drinking. We don't see that it means general drinking in the translations, which is a lot of scholarship. We don't see it meaning that in the lexicons. We don't see it meaning that in the commentaries. We don't see it, potos, meaning general drinking anywhere. What we see potos meaning throughout the scholarship, throughout the translations, throughout the commentaries, everything, is that it means a banquet or an event of some sort. I like BDAG's definition, a social event where wine is being served. And again, BDAG is the gold standard. So we don't see that means general drinking. So no, Peter is not banning drinking in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3. To get to that conclusion, you have to make a ton of logical leaps. And even if you want to take the route of it meaning an event, but it's an event specifically where the drinking does not lead to excess, again, that still doesn't follow that it is banning drinking generally. And I'll give you an example of why this is really quickly. Again, potos is a neutral term. We know that it is because it's being applied in both good and bad manners. In the Old Testament, in the Septuagint, we see it being applied in good manners. And then here in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3, we see it being applied in negative manners. So, because of that, we can use potos as it is a neutral term to compare it to other neutral terms in English. And the term I'm going to use here is a birthday party or a party generally. So, some parties are absolutely sinful and not okay for Christians to attend. One example of this is frat parties. Those are negative. Those have things like drinking and sexual immorality. The drinking there may not lead to excess. It does not necessitate that if you go to a frat party, you must get drunk. But that does not mean that Christians are suddenly allowed to go there. In the same way, though, Christians are perfectly allowed to go to birthday parties, right? So birthday parties are perfectly okay. And sure, there may be drinking there and it may not lead to excess, but that doesn't mean that you're suddenly banned from it. It's the context of where the party is held and what's going on at the party that determines its sinfulness. And in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3, the potos, the party that is there, is specifically in the Gentile or pagan context. Hence why Peter is banning it. It's not banning general drinking. Again, scholarship doesn't show that, translations don't show that, commentaries don't show that. Across the board, we never see that Peter here is banning general drinking. And if he was, that would lead to a ton of contradictions in the Bible, as we will get to in next video. So, in my opinion, this is the worst argument against drinking. There are much better arguments against drinking. I think those fail as well, but there at least are better arguments. So, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope that this was an enjoyable video. I know it's probably a bit scattered, but this is how I felt like I had to do it, seeing as I'm trying to compress, again, 3 hours of content into a shorter video that's under an hour. So thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts down below. We will do 2 more videos on this. We're going to do drinking in the New Testament, and we're going to do historical context about drinking to show, again, why saying that the wine in the Bible, for example, was non-alcoholic doesn't work, or why it was grape juice doesn't work, or why drinking is banned doesn't work. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please let me know your thoughts down below. Yeah, look out for the new podcast episode coming soon. And again, just let me know your thoughts. Like and subscribe if you liked the video. And I hope that you have a very blessed day.